I don't think anyone wakes up in a leadership capacity and says, I want to fail all the people in my span of care today. I don't think anyone does that. I think everyone has the intentions that are right and wants to lead people in the right way. They just don't have the tools.
Welcome to the video version of the Truly Human Leadership podcast, an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Our guest on this episode is Pat Berges, the managing partner and CEO of Chapman Co Leadership Institute, founded by Barry-Wehmiller's late CEO and chairman Bob Chapman, to help organizations improve their leadership, culture, and performance. To find out more, go to ccoleadership.com. And now, here's our conversation with Pat. So, we're going to get to your leadership journey in a second, but I want to talk to you first about your friendship with Bob Chapman. How'd you meet Bob and how'd that friendship develop?
Funny story, actually. I haven't told this publicly, so this will be a breakthrough piece here. I was introduced to Bob by a business leader in the St. Louis area who was familiar with some of the work I had been doing on culture, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, I met this guy who's a complete nut. I think you'd get along with him really well." So that's how he was introduced to me, as a nut who just saw the world differently, and this person thought I would get along with him well. So they put us in touch, and sure enough, we got along very well. That was the start of a very long friendship.
So how did the relationship develop? You know, you meet Bob, which is this kind of random thing. Nobody kind of just randomly met Bob and then just went their own way. Everybody, when they met Bob, were impacted from then on. So how did the relationship go from there?
Yeah, so Bob and I had a lot of parallel paths without knowing it. A lot of what he had been doing at a much larger scale was the exact playbook that I had been running at a much smaller scale as a middle manager for many years. And so after meeting Bob, it all kind of resonated with me. I hadn't read his book. I hadn't even heard of his book until meeting him. And of course, he turned me on to Everybody Matters. And shortly after finishing that book, I got right back on the phone with him and said, "Hey, Bob, we need to talk more about this. This is much bigger than I realized." And he started laughing and said, "Yeah, I told you this is a much bigger mission that I need you to be a part of." So a big part of our relationship kind of came as Bob recruited me to be a part of this mission informally. Just recognizing that I saw the world in the same way he did, and the power of leading people in the right way and the impact that can have on the world. We had immediate alignment in those values, and from there, friendship was easy to forge. So very quickly, he became a source for me of advice and mentorship, where I would come to him with some of the bigger challenges I faced in life and career, and he would always guide me, typically not in the way I was expecting, and that's part of the reasons I really value the friendship, is because he challenged me in unique ways.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Give me a funny Bob story.
Oh, boy.
There's going to be 100 of them, but give me a good funny one.
Okay. Trying to think of a good one that's fit for air here.
Well, there are a lot of those, too, that aren't fit for air.
The jokes that seem to resonate with people around here are the email communications with Bob. That I got a lot of entertainment out of Bob's emails, particularly in the final couple of years. And you're probably familiar with this as well, where you get the subject, which was basically the first two paragraphs of what he was trying to say in all caps, yeah. And then you'd get a body with all caps as well. So it was oftentimes hard to decipher what was really important. And I think in Bob's mind, everything was that important.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes the whole email would be in the subject line. And if you got it on your phone, it would be hard to read because you didn't have the ability to expand it out or anything. So then you're like, I don't know what he wants me to do. But,
yeah, for all of Bob's strengths, there was one weakness that I think everyone can agree on, and that's context giving. He wasn't the best at giving context to his emails. So,
oh yeah, that's so true. That's so funny. So, over the course of your relationship, what did Bob mean to you, and what did you learn from him?
Bob taught me about excellence. He taught me that you can't ever be satisfied with where you are or the progress you've made. When I left Medtronic after a long career at Medtronic, a couple decades there, and started some of my own work and pursuing some of my own endeavors. And Bob was notorious for challenging me on we had a quarterly call where we'd check in. And every time I'd go into those calls, being excited, thinking that I was finally going to get that pat on the back, that he was going to be like, "Yes, you're doing it. You're doing what we were hoping you would do." It was never enough for Bob. He would always say, "Okay, so you reached 200 people this year, Pat. you should reach 200,000 people. That's not enough. You're not moving fast enough. So I learned from Bob a sense of urgency to address this crisis in leadership. It's getting worse. We're seeing data turn the other direction, signaling a much tougher engagement climate that we're in. And so I think Bob was ahead of his time in many ways, but particularly in seeing this crisis emerge long before most others did.
Yeah. You mentioned Medtronic there. Let's talk about your leadership journey. Where'd you get your start in your career? And then how did you kind of come to the place you are now?
Well, I would start my leadership journey long before career. For me, my leadership journey started in my youth, started by the examples around me, as it does for most of us. For me, my mother was kind of the first source of leadership that I learned from and experienced. One of the stories I tell frequently is a story related to my color blindness. So as a young kid, I'm severely colorblind. Had struggled in school when we went to Crayola markers. And you might remember back in the day, they had the names of the colors on the crayons, but not on the markers. And so first to second grade was a big shift. We're going from the crayons to the markers. And so here I was in second grade, and everyone's using markers. And now I didn't have my cheat code. I couldn't just look at the name to say, oh, the grass is green, I'm going to color it green. And so I struggled. We had these color by number exercises where you had to color in the number based upon what color it was supposed to be. And I put my picture up on the wall, and my picture was all whacked. The grass was the wrong color, the sky was the wrong color, the trees were the wrong color. And all the kids in the class started laughing, pointing at the picture, laughing, saying, who drew this, who drew this? So I go home that day, disappointed, frustrated, and my mother pulls me aside and says, what's in your control? What can you control here? I said, well, I can't control anything. I'm colorblind. What do you want me to do? I can't control Crayola. And she said, well, you can't control them, but can you influence them? After a series of coaching conversations, she led me to the library. We look up the CEO of Crayola. I write him a handwritten letter explaining my predicament, and a couple months later, get a letter back in the mail with the first pack of Crayola markers with the names of the colors on them. So for me, that was my very first sense of leadership. It was the very first time I felt what it was like to be led in a way that got a better output of me than I could have gotten by myself. So my mother empowered that action in me, empowered me to see that I could kind of get after this and influence the problem in a way that I didn't think I could. And as a result, not only do we have the names of the colors on the markers now for Crayola, but I also have a sense of empowerment where I see a problem and I know that I have the leadership skills to be able to kind of navigate through that and be resourceful to try to find a solution. So that's where it started for me at a very young age. I started picking up on leadership when it was around me. And I started noticing when people would gravitate towards a certain leader and identifying the traits that they had. What did they do differently? So very early on in career, I kept a list. My grandfather told me, he was a GE executive, worked for Jack Welch for years, and he said, every manager you have in your career, I want you to keep a list of all the positive traits and all the negative traits. And I've kept that list for my entire career. It's almost 3 decades long now, this list of every leader I've come across, what they do good and what they don't do so well. And it's helpful. It's a helpful guide for me as a leader in a leadership capacity now, because I can look back on that and remember how I felt at different phases of my career and what I needed and moments where I didn't get what I needed from the person that was leading me. And so, I would say my leadership journey started at a very young age, and it continues to this day. I don't think a leadership position is ever something you fully achieve. To Bob's message on excellence, it's something we're always striving to get better at and trying to create a bigger impact with. Mm-hmm. But throughout my career, I've been fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of very influential leaders that have made a significant difference in the world. And I've been able to pull from those traits to kind of build a more cohesive leadership model that I think we can teach and help others grow through that learning.
Yeah. It seems that like your time at Medtronic, there was a lot of things that you did when you were there that you carried on through other careers or as your career advanced and into your consulting practice. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think maybe the culture circles came out of that time.
Yeah, so actually the culture circles was kind of the premise for the Bob introduction originally. So culture circles was a program I started at Medtronic back in 2013 or so. And the idea of culture circles was really to create a grassroots movement to empower an organization to where everybody within the organization feels a sense of ownership and feels as though they have the tools and skills and ability to drive change, just like I did with the Crayola markers. And so, we started this program at Medtronic in 2013, and it quickly grew to touch more than 10,000 people at the organization and spread throughout other organizations. Back in 2023, we launched a program with the Michigan State Police, a kind of volunteer cause to roll out a similar sort of methodology with the Michigan State Police. We branded that as Trust Builder, but same methodology where we identify an organizational challenge, a statement that's kind of overarching for the entire enterprise or organization, and then we activate teams at a subculture level to solve for that problem. And what you end up finding out is there's no silver bullet to solving cultural challenges within an organization. You might have kind of a common problem that the organization faces, but there might be 100 different ways to solve for that problem based upon what function you're in, what department you're in, what region you're in, right? So many subcultures will interpret that organizational challenge differently. It'll show up for them in different ways. So this approach allows for each of these subcultures to really get after solving for that problem. At the end of the whole cycle of culture circles, what a lot of people come to realize is, they go through this orchestrated project plan where they're going through a discovery phase and learning more about the challenge. They're ideating with their small subculture team to try to solve for that problem. And they pilot the solution locally, they measure the results, and then they come back to the capstone event and they're presenting their solutions out. Now imagine a company large in size and scale where you have one organizational problem that you've identified through, say, your organizational culture surveys, and then you activate 10, 12, 20 different teams to get after that problem, but open to their own interpretation. Well, what you get at the end of that is you have very diverse solutions to one common problem. And then leaders can come in and take that playbook, that playbook, that playbook, or a piece of that playbook, a piece of this playbook, and put them together for their organization and what works. So the thesis behind this is there's no silver bullet to solve culture. The way you solve cultural challenges is by empowering people at the grassroots level to feel a sense of ownership and pride in their organization.
Was there an inciting, reason that this idea happened? Like, was there a certain circumstance or situation that prompted this model?
So in Medtronic's case, this was actually pre-Medtronic. Covidien was the company, and Covidien was eventually acquired by Medtronic. But at the time, there were two businesses that we were bringing together. And those two businesses had been clashing in a number of ways culturally. And so the initial effort was to try to bring those businesses together to operate more collaboratively in the organization. And what we came to learn throughout a few phases of that is this actually serves as a very solid integration tool as well. So then when Medtronic came along and acquired Covidien, this was the largest med tech deal in history, when they came in and acquired Covidien, this served as a key integration tool for integrating those two companies. And so, initially the intent was strictly to kind of bring these two cultures together and create more collaboration. But what we found throughout the process is not only does it serve value in integration and bringing teams together and creating empowerment, but it serves a very valid developmental purpose. Right? You think about the emergence of AI and other technologies, and what that's doing is it's taking away from career development opportunities in early career, right? So those of us more senior in career, we've had the opportunities early in career to have those early career development experiences. Well, now we're going to have agents doing a lot of that work. So those development experiences are disappearing quickly, right? So I think part of the Culture Circles journey, what it allows individuals within a company to do is to cut their teeth on experiences that they wouldn't necessarily get in their day-to-day job. Perhaps it's an individual contributor that has an opportunity to lead a team of peers through this 6-month engagement and through the project plan. Perhaps it's getting up on stage and presenting your ideas to senior leadership is an experience that you've never had the opportunity to learn from. And so Culture Circles not only helps with integration tools, but it serves a very meaningful development purpose to give people real experience on the job growth. And it also serves to build bonds within teams. When people have these shared experiences and can kind of share emotions and struggle together, they form closer cohesion. So through that, when you have a program like Culture Circles, taking over an organization and creating this movement within an organization, what ends up happening is you create these strong internal networks that didn't exist before. And so the benefits of a culture program like Culture Circles, while it might have an intended output that you're kind of setting off to launch this with, what we see happening with other companies adopting this is it's serving a whole lot of different needs across the development spectrum, across the cultural spectrum, across the empowerment spectrum. So there's a lot of benefits that come from this beyond just the surface level benefits.
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit. Everybody had a weird 2020, 2021. Everybody had difficult times during then. You were part of something then that was very important. Can you talk about your role then a little bit?
So I happened to be responsible for the global training related to our respiratory business at the time at Medtronic. And obviously the respiratory business was in high demand during COVID. We were manufacturers of ventilators. And one of the challenges that emerged that kind of stayed below the radar of the media for some time was, you had the initial blitz of, we're short on ventilators. We don't have enough ventilators. And everyone remembers that phase, right? It was the March, April timeframe of 2020. Well, once ventilator manufacturing finally started picking up, several companies, shared their IP, and there were new emergents. So all of a sudden, ventilators were no longer a problem. There were lots of ventilators before too long. By the end of March, ventilators were coming in, and everyone thought the problem was solved. But my group was very close to the customer, and what we were hearing from customers is, hey, listen, it's great that we now have ventilators, but we were used to working with 3, maybe 4, 5 types of ventilators at our hospital, and now we've got 30 different types of ventilators at our hospital. And it's not a plug-and-play machine. If you know how to work one, doesn't necessarily mean you know how to work the other. Very complex medical devices. And so, we saw this problem emerging where customers were calling saying, we don't know how to work any of these. And so immediately, every independent company is saying, okay, well, we can solve that for you. We can solve that for you. And being one of the larger suppliers, we had customers coming to us saying, that's not enough. We need someone to solve it for everyone. I can't go to 30 different company web pages to figure out how to work this. I need one place to go. And so that was kind of the premise of the Ventilator Training Alliance. This was an app that was developed in partnership with a technology company called Allego, who dedicated their entire enterprise to building this app for us. And within 20 days, from April 1st to April 20th, this went from concept to an actual app in the App Store. Within the first few weeks, it was one of the fastest, one of the most downloaded apps in the world, and reached over 200 countries. Countless lives saved from this, but this was essentially an app that brought together all of the ventilator manufacturers in the world and had all of their content available on this Ventilator Training Alliance app for free, available to anyone around the world, translated in any form they needed it. So ended up being a great success. It was a very challenging time and very challenging project, but we ended up winning a global medical innovation of the year award. And during 2020, that's a pretty big accomplishment. Bob played a big role in this, as a matter of fact. So this was during years where Bob and I were having very regular mentoring conversations, and so I called him up pre-launch. It was sometime in that first 20 days in April of 2020, and explained to him the project I was working on and what I was trying to do, and was seeking his advice on how we get this out. Now, we had built the app. Now, how do we tell everyone about it? And he said, you know what? You need to meet Simon Sinek. And I said, well, yeah, that'd be great, Bob. And he said, he happens to be a very close friend of mine. I'll introduce you. And so that was the start of my relationship with Simon, was through that introduction that Bob had made. And he said, Simon's the best marketer I know. He can give you some ideas on how to get this thing off the ground.
It was a crazy time. And just everything that you're describing there kind of illustrates how, much was happening in such a short amount of time. There had to be some leadership lessons that you got out of that time. Can you think of any off the top of your head?
Oh, I can think of countless leadership lessons. One in particular, there was resistance on the solution that we provided. There was a lot of resistance. And I remember one particular conversation where I was given the direction to focus on solving this for us. And that didn't feel right. It felt like we had a bigger responsibility. And I got some coaching from a leader of mine at the time who said, here's how we're going to do this. You're going to do that first. You're going to solve the problem for us first, and then you can solve it for everyone else. So, one of the key lessons there was my interpretation of no, don't do this was not what I was being told. The interpretation needed to be rethought and looked at from a different lens. I think the other key learning I had on this is, you're in these situations of crisis, and it's easy to think that's someone else's problem to solve. I'm not the one to solve that. For me, in the Ventilator Training Alliance, it was a clinical problem, right? A clinical training problem. I don't have a clinical background. I don't know anything about ventilators or how to work them or how to train people how to work them. I could have easily said, not my job. I also am not a tech wizard. I don't know how to make apps or develop software. Could have easily said, nope, out of my scope. Not my job to mess with this. But I go back to a quote that someone shared with me, someone on the project team, one of the executives at Allego, the software developer. He referred to Margaret Mead's quote, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world, because in fact, that's the only thing that ever has. And here we were, a small working group of people that didn't necessarily have the qualifications or the responsibility to solve this problem, but in fact we did. And it made a major difference for a lot of families around the world and touched a lot of lives. Probably a lot of people that wouldn't be here today had this small group of people not gotten together and said, we can make a difference here. Yeah. So I think that's the biggest lesson is, you look at a problem or a crisis and it's easy to turn the other way and to think, oh, that's someone else's problem to deal with. But I think when we reflect on how we want to show up as leaders, regardless of what problem we encounter, we should always think we have something to offer in terms of solutions or can be a part of finding that solution.
Yeah. Well, and now speaking of Simon and speaking of finding solutions, you met Simon and you became a part of an initiative that he was leading to find a solution to another, not necessarily a big problem in the world, but big issues in the world, the curve. Tell us about that experience.
So I initially met Simon through Bob, as mentioned, and he had offered some advice on the Ventilator Training Alliance. And Simon and I had stayed in touch for the years that followed. And I got invited to one of the events that Barry-Wehmiller hosted in Aspen, called the Massive Conference. And Simon invited me to this conference with a dozen or so other people. One of the people there was the police chief for the state of Michigan. And we hit it off real well and spent some time together and developed a friendship at this event. And as we're wrapping up the event, Joe Gasper, the chief of police in Michigan, says, hey, I have some things I'm working on related to talent and culture within my organization. Can I give you a call next week and just pick your brain a little bit? So I said, of course, Joe, give me a call. So he calls me a few days later, and one thing leads to another. Now we're having calls every other day. Next thing you know, we launch this program within his organization. And so we were kind of 2 months into this. I had kind of recruited this volunteer army of 50 people to help drive this initiative forward. And it was unintentionally designed at reshaping the policing community in the United States. It wasn't work I had intended to go down that path, but that's what we were doing, taking the same model that we used in the private sector and applying it to the public sector. And we had amazing results with that. And so as we're getting these results, Simon's starting to tune in more and more, and he says, hey, I need you to come take me through this program. I want to get my fingerprints on it as well. So we started working together on this program, and within 2 or 3 months of that, he pulled me in and asked me to be the executive director of The Curve, which is the nonprofit he started in 2020, I believe, with a group of police leaders around the country, and it's really aimed at introducing a more progressive culture to policing and addressing some of the leadership challenges that we face in that industry. And so he's brought together some of the most progressive police leaders in the country, and for 2 years I ran that nonprofit with Simon and made some pretty good progress on that front.
What are some of the things that you think that you are most proud of with your time at The Curve, the things that you accomplished during that time?
Or the group accomplished?
Yeah, I will say it was a shift for me in that I learned working in the public sector and private sector, it's a very different environment. There's a very different pace. There's a very different appetite for change. And so I would say I probably learned more about myself and how to lead in that environment than anything. In terms of progress, I think, the work of the curve is work that's never going to end, just like much of the leadership work that we do in other spaces. It's a constant evolution, and I think all we can hope for is steady progress in that regard. With policing, it has to start at the academy level, and it has to kind of go throughout the entire organization. And so, there's a level of buy-in that I see happening now that I didn't see happening 3 or 4 years ago. And so, from my vantage point, that's some really good progress, that we have more people buying in, we have more interest and appetite into learning more progressive leadership methodologies.
There's like a commonality in terms of some of the issues that you will see in one sector as in the other sector. When you moved into consulting on your own after the curve, was that some of the thoughts in your mind is like, I've been working with this specific group of people, and a very intense, specialized group of people, but there's a lot of commonality with what I saw in my corporate life, and I can take that. Was that some of your thinking at the time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think leadership is transferable across just about any industry, any community role. Any way you look at leadership, we are looking for the same things out of a leader. And there's lots of research on this. Regardless of where you are in the world, you're looking for the same qualities in a leader. You're looking for a leader that you trust and that trusts you, right? You're looking for a leader that cares for you and supports you. You're looking for a leader that's strategic, right? So all of these pieces are consistent across all industries. Now, I will say it varies by level, and there are some variations across industries as well. But I think part of it, you have to look at kind of where they're coming from and meet people where they are, right? If we went into the curve and tried to introduce truly human leadership and the Barry-Wehmiller, the Chapman Co methodology, it'd probably be too much, right? It'd probably be too much too fast to throw all that at an organization that wasn't ready for it. And so I think part of what we do at Chapman Co that makes us unique and different is we take the time to really understand where our clients are, to diagnose their needs and to understand what the right tools and the right solutions are to help them get to the next level. So understanding kind of that baseline on what everyone kind of needs and wants in a leader, but then also understanding the intricacies of, okay, here's where they are, here's where they want to be, and here's how we need to get there.
So you moved from the curve to your own consulting company, H3 Consulting, which incidentally, I don't know if this is purposeful or not, but did you take Heads, Hands, and Heart from Bob?
No. It was in fact, I didn't even know that was a Bob thing or a Barry-Wehmiller thing until my first day here. And I think I saw it on the wall down here. Yeah. But so H3 Leadership is my company, Head, Hands, Heart, and the model it's based upon the leadership model that I've built over the past 20 years, which is the theory that the most inspiring leaders lead with their head, their hands, and their heart. And if you think about the generational shifts, this is a big part of why leadership needs to remain in focus right now, is there's a changing game right before our eyes. 75% of our workforce will be millennials or younger within the next 2 years, right? Millennials have very different expectations than those that are in their 50s and 60s in career. Very different expectations of a leader. So when you think about that model, head, hands, heart, think back to kind of the parents of our generation. For my parents, what they were looking for in a leader was someone that was strategic, right? Someone that kind of knew themselves well enough but could pivot and agile. These are leading with the head factors, right? Our generation came along and we're like, yeah, that's cool. We want that. We need all those things. But we also want leaders that lead with their hands, that are resourceful and that empower people and that support their team. Well, this next generation has come along and they said, yep, we need that. We need this, but we also need this. We need leaders that are bold and that are authentic and empathetic and selfless in the way that they lead. And so this leadership model, I think, is important for modern leaders to grasp because we're managing a workforce that's all over the place. And so part of this is having the agility as a leader to be able to pivot and kind of know who you're working with and what their needs are. But the other part is just understanding that, we need to look more holistically at how we're leading humans, right? And how we want to be led is how those in our care want to be led. And so understanding those key drivers that will make people feel valued, seen, and heard will ultimately get better discretionary effort out of them and ultimately lead to better results.
Well, and so then all that alignment brings you here to Barry-Wehmiller, Chapman Co. And let's talk about that. You were doing your own work and still maintaining a relationship with Bob, who can be very persuasive at times. So how did you get to Chapman Co?
I didn't even realize Bob was trying to get me to Chapman Co.
He could do that.
He was very slick, yeah. I know he didn't believe in sales, but he was sure selling pretty hard. For probably 2 years, he was actively recruiting me, and I thought we were just having career conversations. And it wasn't until a year ago this time we were talking, and he said, your company and the work you're doing would be a perfect fit with Chapman Co. Leadership Institute. And so we started having that conversation about Chapman Co. acquiring H3 Leadership. And we were about 6 months into the diligence, and things were going really well with Bob and with the Forsyth team. And they said, okay, we're going to hit pause now for a few months because we're going to hire our CEO for Chapman Co. We've had a gap here, and we want to hire this position before we close this deal. And so I said, okay, cool, no hurry. I wasn't necessarily set on selling my company that I had built or jumping back into a bigger company. So I didn't think much about it. And then a month or two go by, and I see the job description, and I read this job description over for the CEO of Chapman Co. And it just stopped me in my tracks. I literally froze in my seat, and my jaw dropped, and I read it like 4 or 5 times. And I just kept thinking to myself, if I could write my own job description in a perfect world, I don't think I'd change a word on this. So I was bought in with kind of how it was positioned. And then over the 6 months that followed, I started coming in and meeting the leadership here at Barry-Wehmiller and at Forsyth Group. And I will say I was just blown away with how real it was. A lot of companies have big words on a wall, and have a mission statement and talk a big game. Very few companies actually live that game. And it became very clear to me that this is a company that walks the walk. This is a company that does what they say they're going to do, and the values that they stand behind, they live those as well.
So then we get to earlier this year, and Bob was still with us. We didn't realize we didn't have that much time with him, but Bob's still talking to you, and you decided to take the position. What was that conversation with him like?
Oh, it was powerful. It was very powerful. He said to me, we had a few very powerful conversations at the end there, and one of the things that will always stay with me is he said, "It's your turn. My work here is done. It's your turn." And it should have signaled to me, what was coming. I also didn't realize it was that close, but him passing the torch in a way, acknowledging the responsibility that we have, and I think feeling the comfort that it was in good hands. And he had said to me during that conversation that his biggest fear was that when he left this earth, that the message would leave this earth. And so literally in my final conversation with him, my words were, I promise you for the rest of my life, I will be living this mission and pursuing this mission. And so you don't have to worry about that as long as I'm here. This will live on. So, his some very powerful words in the closing days. That the all caps "It's your turn" email is one that I have framed at home.
My last text from him was in all caps too. He was a little frustrated with something though. That was the difference there. At Barry-Wehmiller, and this is something we're starting to articulate more and more, our vision at Barry-Wehmiller is to redefine success in business by demonstrating how human and economic vibrancy work in harmony. Chapman Co. is part of Barry-Wehmiller, but it's kind of a special part of Barry-Wehmiller. How does Chapman Co. fit into that vision of Barry-Wehmiller?
People and performance in harmony is what Chapman Co. is all about. We are a high-performance driving company. Our goal is to help other organizations reach higher potential, and we do that through truly human leadership. The model is pretty simple. When you care for people in the right way, you get better results. And so there's absolutely a way to have people and performance in harmony. Unfortunately, many organizations don't get that. There's basic elements of psychological safety that aren't met, to where you can't possibly say you're a people-focused organization if you're doing forever layoffs, for example, right? You're not going to create psychological safety if you're laying people off every single quarter, because then every employee is sitting there waiting for the next shoe to drop, right? It's this trend. I think Glassdoor created that term of the forever layoff. But think back to even 5 years ago, companies were laying off people in bunches. You'd have one quarter out of every 2 or 3 years where you'd see layoffs, and of course that has to happen. That's the harsh reality of business. There are times when we have to make cuts like that. But the way you do it and the way you treat people with dignity says a lot about your organization and about your leadership. And so I think the companies that are mindful of the importance of psychological safety in their entire team, and people being able to come to work and feel comfortable that they're secure, they're safe, they're not going to have to be looking over their shoulder, right? Because when they are, they're not taking risks, they're not being innovative, they're not challenging status quo, right? That's what we want in a high-performing organization. We want all those characteristics. And so the ability to create psychological safety, I think, is the very basic first step of understanding what the people part of that is, right? The people and performance and harmony. The other piece on performance is I think a lot of companies kind of feel like it's either or, right? We can either be a high-performance company or this like warm and fuzzy, very employee-friendly company. Well, you can be both. In fact, you're going to get better results if you do the people side, right? So you're gonna get better output because discretionary effort is real, right? People will be willing to give you more if they know that you have their back. And so I think the people and performance and harmony is what we do at Chapman Co. We help companies find the path towards finding that harmony.
Yeah. I guess it was probably about 13 years ago or so that Bob did his TEDx, and one of the big statements he made was that there was a crisis in leadership. And, I've been part of Barry-Wehmiller for 12 years and worked with Bob all of that time. And you'd see waves of things, right? You'd see trends happening. You'd see more books being written about leadership. You'd see it being talked about more in the news, that there needs to be a different way to lead, or the millennial conversation happened at one point. And so now we're in 2026, and over the last 5-6 years, there's been a lot of change, a whole lot of change in the world, and change that Bob probably wouldn't have envisioned in 13 years ago. What do you see right now as being the leadership landscape, and is what Bob said 13 years ago still true today?
Oh, it's even more true today, in my opinion. Bob was a prophet way ahead of his time in terms of predicting the emergence of a leadership crisis. I think there are two forces that are at play right now that are really putting a much greater emphasis on leaders in the workplace. Number one, it's AI, right? The emergence of AI, it's creating commoditization of intelligence and putting more of an emphasis on the EQ of a leader, right? So the emotional intelligence of a leader is going to drive much better followership moving forward than IQ did in the past. So that's one element. The other piece with AI that we mentioned, that we talked about earlier, is the earlier career individuals are getting less exposure to meaningful development on the job because of AI. And so, again, creates more of an emphasis on leaders to help guide those individuals through early career in particular. But I think the other piece is the millennials, right? The shifting workforce. 75% of the workforce being millennials or younger, they have different expectations of leaders. We cannot take the old leadership models and apply them to the current workforce dynamics. It just will not work. And we see that. The data tells us that today. I think the latest Gallup research shows that 20% of employees are engaged right now. 2024 to 2025, it was a 5-point drop. Went from 27% down to 22% engagement. So the data backs that up. It's a problem. And look, managers want to lead. I think people that are put in a leadership position want to be effective. I don't think anyone wakes up in a leadership capacity and says, I want to fail all the people in my span of care today. I don't think anyone does that. I think everyone has the intentions that are right and wants to lead people in the right way. They just don't have the tools. And that's where Chapman Co comes in. We have well-researched, well-studied best practices that we can help organizations apply to improve their leadership capability.
So here you are. You've been with Chapman Co a couple months now, and you've got the torch, and it's ready to go. What's your vision for Chapman Co? What's your vision and your hope for Chapman Co and where you guys go?
Well, I'll take it up a higher level and say what my vision for leadership in the world is, because it ties back to this. So I believe that if we create better leaders in the world, that we will get better output, right? It's that simple. And the equation for creating better leaders is not unknown. We have the data that tells us what the more effective leaders are doing differently. And so, if we want to solve the bigger problems that we're facing in the world, it starts at a very personal level. We touch the lives one by one of the people that we lead. Brick by brick is how we build a bigger house. And so I think that this journey has to start on individual relationship. As far as Chapman Co. on how we plan to make a difference, well, I think we have the tools that will make a difference for organizations. I think we have the right assessment methodologies and tools to be able to identify talent. I think we have the right cultural intervention tools to go in and discover what the organizational challenges are and how we can partner with an organization to help solve for those. I think we have innovative training solutions that are highly experiential, highly differentiated than anything else you're going to find on the market, and offerings that are unique. For example, the listening program. Bob used to always say this to audiences. He would say, there's 4 primary forms of communication, right? Reading, writing, speaking, and listening. When you're early in education, you're taught how to read, you're taught how to write. Maybe some advanced education in high school or college, you'll have a speaking class, or maybe a couple of them if you're lucky. But how many listening classes have you had? Yet that's what we should be doing with 80% of our time. Right, so we have differentiated offerings that I think will make a difference if leaders can invest time into building new skills to lead in future generations.
Yeah. If you're a leader and you're listening to this today, and you've heard a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about, obviously your first answer would be, come talk to us at Chapman Co. We want to connect with you. But what would you say with that leader who just is on the fence about getting started?
Yeah, I would tell them they're not alone. There's lots of organizations out there that have been skeptical. I was a skeptic myself before seeing that this is possible. So you're not alone in that. If you're out there and you're listening to this thinking this could be of value to me, but I just don't know how to get started, well, I would say reach out. Let us put you in touch with some organizations that have been on that same journey recently, and you can talk with them and learn how we can guide an organization through that and help them drive that change.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Really appreciate it today. And don't forget to find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Barry-Wehmiller. And you can find our podcasts, articles, and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. And don't forget to check out Chapman Co Leadership Institute at ccoleadership.com, where you can learn all about everything Pat was talking about today. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Thanks for listening.